Tony Garza is the former U.S. ambassador to Mexico under George W. Bush administration. Born in Brownsville, he earned a bachelor's degree from UT Austin and a law degree from SMU. He practiced law until becoming elected a Cameron County judge in 1988. Then Governor Bush appointed him Texas Secretary of State in 1995. He was later elected to the very powerful Texas Railroad Commission, where he served as chairman. In 2002, he was appointed ambassador to Mexico, a position he held until 2009. That year, Garza received the Águila Azteca, the highest award that Mexico bestows on foreigners. Currently, he serves as counsel with White & White LLP and is chairman of a management consultancy firm, Villanova Ventures. He is acknowledged as one of the top experts on U.S.-Mexico relations and on the business and political environments of both nations. Ambassador Garcia, welcome home to the Valley. Garza, I'm sorry.
Don't we just love to correct the media? Every now and then we get a chance to do it.
You've only been here less than 24 hours. What is it like being back home?
Well, it's always great being home. And I never feel as though I'm completely gone. I guess that's the beauty of the Valley. Whether you're gone a day, a week, a month, the embrace is always very warm. So it feels good. It feels good. I guess my first impressions are always those of growth, a certain energy, good things happening, I think, in and around the Valley. So that's always, that's a good thing to see.
Excellent. Now, part of the reason that you left this region was to serve then Governor Bush. And I have to ask, what was it like working for Governor Bush?
Well, it was a great opportunity. Obviously, I'd had the honor of representing the people in South Texas in Cameron County as a judge there for 6 years. And as Chuy pointed out, we always like to talk about this. The evening I was elected, Chuy just shook his head and he says, well, the sky hadn't fallen. I think things are going to be okay. At that point, we hadn't elected a Republican since about Reconstruction. And I guess in many respects, that was how I was able to get on then George. He was not the governor yet, then George's radar. Later, I would come to know him as a candidate and as the governor. And one of the things that I was most impressed by was this sense of humanity. A very warm person, a very generous of spirit. I remember the first time campaigning with him when he was challenging Governor Richards. And we were in West Brownsville on a soccer field. I was then coaching soccer, and I'd taken him out to meet, the parents and work the field and this sort of thing. And you saw somebody with a very genuine warmth, a real feel for the area and the people. So it wasn't a very difficult decision. As much as I hated leaving county government, when he asked me to serve as Secretary of State, the opportunity to serve him in Austin was something I was very excited about and very much enjoyed doing.
What was he like as a leader?
I think he was a good leader, somebody that had a very clear sense of self. As you go through life, you have people that you can look to, and you know that one word really sums them up. And I think for George W. Bush, that word was integrity. A very strong sense of self, of purpose, a clear sense of the values that would guide him each day, and a willingness to work with people. He wasn't so committed to that compass that he said, no, there's only one way to do this. He said, we want to head in this direction, but we want to do that in a way that brings people to the table so that we're moving together. And I think you saw that in his style as governor, his agenda, which was to reform criminal justice and the rein in the abusive system of lawsuits, focusing on education and accountability, yet at the same time trusting local people. It was an agenda that he was guided by a core set of principles and always dealt with people with a very real integrity. I tell folks, when you have a leader like that, it's easy to be a follower. And there's no stigma attached to following somebody who's a real leader. And so it was a lesson in leadership and it was an opportunity to see the state of Texas from a very different perspective.
So here's a man that you know and called as George.
I didn't call him that after he was elected.
But he suddenly...
But I will say, just as an aside, after he was elected, I said, "Governor?" And he says, "George is fine." And I said, "No, it's not often that I'll have somebody that I'm as dear a friend of as you and will have the honor to call governor." And it took me a little bit after he was elected president, that transition, to move from governor to Mr. President. But I got to tell you, it didn't take too long. And he didn't discourage that one.
So he's elected president, and then he calls on you to serve the nation as ambassador. What was that experience like for you personally?
Well, there a lot of emotion. And I'll try to tell two quick asides without spending too much time on them. Actually, and I don't know that I've ever shared this, but in 1996, then Governor Bush and I were traveling to Mexico, as he did a number of times, to meet with Mexican leadership. At that point, President Cedillo was then in office, and we were meeting with his Minister of Foreign Relations, Gurria, on the whole range of issues that I think really Texas governors should be engaged with Mexico on. And we were sitting in the garden there of a very well-known hotel in Mexico City. And at that point, we were absolutely barred from any discussion or mention of the possibility that he would seek the presidency. And I was sitting there, and he was probably having an O'Toole's, and I'm sure I was enjoying the tequila. And he looked at me, he says, "You know, if I go, I'm going to win." And I knew exactly what he was talking about. And through the course of the rest of that conversation, I thought, well, if he's willing to share that, I'm going to put a marker down as well. I said, "And if you do, I'd like to come right back here on your behalf." And and I think it was a lot left unspoken. And when he was elected, I was then in the second year of my 6-year term as a railroad commissioner. As you know, the railroad commissioners are elected for 6 years. And I stayed on for another 2 years to complete a 4-year period on the commission. And I was actually campaigning on someone's behalf in San Antonio, and was in the middle of a press conference when then my then chief of staff, Mary Frazier, looked at me, and she was pointing at the phone. And you're sitting there, and the press is in front of you, and you're trying to talk about what a great fellow this was, this long since forgotten fellow. And she kept pointing at the phone, and I realized I'm going to have to walk away from my own press conference in the middle of, with no explanation to the media. So I walked away, and I took the phone, and it was the president. And it's interesting, and I've since come to realize that this is how they do it. They give themselves a lot of space for. He says, "Listen, Garza, I'm thinking about," first caveat, "and if I do," second caveat, "would you consider taking this?" Well, that gives him a lot of space for me to go, yeah, and him to say, "Well, let me think about it." So essentially, he got the yeah out of me, and I got the, "Well, Clay will give you a call." Clay was his then director of personnel, and that's how it actually happened. On a very personal level, it was, I guess I'll try to put it this way. My dad owned a filling station in downtown Brownsville. And when I was elected to the Railroad Commission, which, as you know, regulates energy in the state of Texas, on the day of my swearing in, I said, only in Texas can the son of somebody that pumps gas for a living grow up to chair the commission that regulates the entire energy sector in the state of Texas. And I guess my thought was, and only in America can the grandsons of grandparents that immigrated to the United States from Mexico grow up to represent the United States in their home country. It's humbling, and yet at the same time, there was a challenge and a satisfaction that came with my having this sense that everything I had done, both in my private and professional and public life, had prepared me for that moment. And I think that was the way the president felt. So to have that sort of confidence and that personal sense of challenge, yet at the same time feeling as though, I put in the hours on the practice field, I'm ready for this one, is a remarkable feeling.
Now, growing up on the border, did you feel prepared for your new role in Mexico?
Without, I don't want to sound presumptuous or arrogant, but I feel very comfortable with it. I had a sense that having grown up where I did and how I did, and I think this is true of anybody that's grown up in the Rio Grande Valley and along the border, one of the things that we learn to do is what I characterize as shifting gears. You're constantly shifting gears as you move throughout the community, as you move through areas of varying advantage, as you move across to and from each day that strip of river that separates the United States and Mexico, McAllen, Reynosa, Brownsville, Matamoros. You're constantly shifting gears in a way that you develop, I think, in the Valley, one of the, a very heightened emotional intelligence, for lack of a better word, the capacity to deal with people. When you couple that with an interest in the substantive, with an interest in the history of the two countries and the policy areas and the issues that you'll face, I felt that everything I had done, whether it be at the local or state level, and in my family, and in downtown Brownsville, had prepared me for that. So, I felt confident, and there was a very good team in place. But that didn't mean it didn't come without its challenges. Listen, in my first couple of months, Mexico was on the Security Council. They were not going to support our president on the resolution in Iraq. They were adamant about it. I don't care how people feel about you personally. You are still the embodiment of the United States abroad and have certain responsibilities. And they feel that you will be the object of their criticism and their emotions and their feelings. So as you imagine 6 weeks into a job, taking the position that we did on Iraq, not having them support us, there were days when I'd have rather been the piñata at your children's party, right? But it's what you do, and one of the things I think is very important to realize is you never take it entirely personally. You have a job to do, and you have positions to take, and you have a country to represent, and there's nothing you could do more proudly. So there were days when it was challenging, but I never felt as though I wasn't prepared for it.
Now, Vicente Fox was president of Mexico then. What was he like?
A good man. I think that one of the things that he had to deal with, quite frankly, was these enormous expectations that were laid at his front door. Here was an individual that had swept out a government in the PRI that had essentially been in power for 70 years. He rode in on this enormous this wave of democracy. Big strapping fellow, lots of charisma, takes the oath, promising reform, looks across the aisle and finds a Congress still dominated by his opposition. And so I think the story was one of democracy, one of reform, one of change. But the reality was one now that would face divided government. And so I think he had some challenges that people from the outside probably didn't appreciate completely. But with that said, I think if you look at what has evolved in Mexico over the course of the last, probably 25 or 30 years, on the economic side, you go back to De La Madrid and his accession to the GATT, Salinas, NAFTA. Cedillo stood up some institutions on electoral reform and was sort of the transitional figure that allowed, if you will, Fox to move in. So you've had these both economic and political transitions to more of a market-based country and more of a democracy. And Fox was emblematic of that. Calderon had his challenges. Now you have a Mexico that really, I think, is very well positioned, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a second, to really to be one of the leaders on the in terms of contributing to the global economics. So he was a good man, and I think in many respects will be appreciated as a transitional figure, not necessarily a reformer, because he didn't have the legislature necessarily that would allow him to be a reformer, but an important transitional figure.
How did President Bush and President Fox get along?
They got along well. I think, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to comment on something. I think sometimes we want to reduce our relationship with a country like Mexico to what I call the big men. How do our two presidents relate? Did they do the full abrazo, the half abrazo? Did they both have ranches? Did they both wear boots? Did they smile at each? And I think in a way that's nice because it capsulizes, but I don't think it captures completely the extent, if you will, not just of integration. We talk about integration in terms of our economies, but the real convergence between the United States and Mexico, whether it's cultural, economic, the demography of the United States changing as rapidly as it is. I mean, there's such a convergence and so many connections on so many levels that to reduce it to how did our two presidents get along sometimes I think misses the larger point of what has happened for our two economies. With that said, they got along well. I saw, honestly, I think we made too much of the stylistic similarities, if you will. But in terms of some of the policy issues, I actually thought President Bush and President Calderon had a very direct way of speaking to each other and a very direct way of talking about issues that in many respects suggested a closer working relationship. Great respect for them both, obviously. Great affinity with both presidents, but I think in terms of the working relationship, the day in and day out, President Bush and President Calderon, particularly with respect to the Mérida initiative, did a great deal together.
Well, let's ask a little bit about the continued relationship with President Fox. What policies did President Bush and Fox formulate together that is impacting the region today?
Well, I think if you look back at the certainly things like the Partnership for Prosperity, which it's one of these initiatives on the federal level that most of us in this room would say, of course, it's about time. But it dealt very specifically with initiatives along the border, integrating technology into the flow of people and goods back and forth. The truth of the matter is, in the wake of 9/11, there had to be a much more heightened and focused focus on security. But at the same time, you just couldn't choke traffic and bring it to a standstill. So a lot of the initiatives that they focused on were everything from the vax, the big X-rays, trying to move towards or away from the border approval for customs purposes. Just things focused on the flow of traffic at the airports, things like advanced passenger lists and the approval of people, so folks moving in and out of your countries. A lot of things that you'd say, yeah, of course these things should be going on, but they hadn't theretofore. Even though many times we in the Valley had advocated and tried to lobby for some of these initiatives, in the context of funding, there wasn't the urgency. And in the wake of 9/11, there was more urgency, and these two presidents started working on things that we had advocated for years. So I would think some of those types of initiatives, just to make for the safe and secure flow of goods and services back and forth. And we still know they bottleneck, but their initiatives were that sort of level of focus.
What other impact did 9/11 have on the two countries and the relationship with one another?
Well, almost, I guess almost paradoxically, in the sense that we had more of a focus on security, it moved us to a much closer relationship. And let me use intelligence as an example. historically, we had engaged with Mexico at a level that I call the ritual exchange of information. Sometimes as ritual as simply exchanging press releases. I mean, there was not the level of communication of information that you would really expect between neighbors and to use the term, not in a military sense, but in allies, because Mexico was always very careful not to sort of be an ally because of their own foreign policy. But we went from this exchange of information to, and out of necessity, to the exchange of intelligence, to the capacity to exchange intelligence nearly real time. And I think if you think about that and you appreciate what that means, by the time you are exchanging intelligence real time, it's the only way that intelligence is ever really actionable. If you don't have something in a very timely way, neither your security people or your law enforcement people or your intelligence community can do much with that intelligence. Once it's old, once it's stale, it's as a practical matter worthless. And if you look at that period, you say, well, what forced that? Well, from the standpoint of the United States, it was our desire to have intelligence so that we would have a much more secure perimeter in terms of what was going on Mexico's southern border, in terms of movements of people through Mexico. And you might think, well, Mexico had an interest as well in order to do this, and their interests were also very real. And I remember very clearly during that period, and this was during the Fox administration, there had been that incident in Bali where tourists were targeted and terrorists had attacked. Essentially, they weren't going after Bali so much, they were going after US tourists there. Or if you looked at the Bay of Campeche and the oil-producing assets in that region, if you were to attack there, well, partly you'd be hitting Mexico, but the U.S. is the biggest consumer of that product, our economy would be impacted. So I think Mexico realized that they had some real vulnerabilities by virtue of this level of convergence with the U.S. economy. So they had a very real interest in making sure that we went from information to intelligence to real time. And so I think that, curiously, was the single biggest movement in terms of the level of confidence and trust that we saw evolve during the last decade.
Now, Felipe Calderon succeeds Vicente Fox. What was he like?
He is. I mean, he's now a Harvard professor. He is a straightforward, very focused, disciplined individual who I think even today would admit that he did not appreciate completely the challenge that he would have as a president. And the example, or the, I guess, metaphor that he's used, he said, listen, I knew my country had challenges. I knew we had a transnational or a criminal organization problem. He said, but when I assumed the presidency and I sat down with intelligence, I thought I would open up a patient and have to remove a tumor. He said, I didn't appreciate that I would open up a patient and see a completely metastasized cancer. That's more or less the way the President Calderon characterized it. So he went from an individual that had essentially run on economic reform and some of the issues that you are now seeing come to fruition, and had to focus on a full frontal engagement of these transnational organizations in his country with very few tools. We can be critical of, let's say, the use of the military in law enforcement, but when you criticize that, ask yourself, what other enforcement tool did he have at his disposal? Did he have local police? No. Did he have state law enforcement? No. Did he have a federal civil sort of citizens law enforcement as you know, we look at our FBI and our federal law enforcement? No. He had the military, he had the Army and the Navy. So he had to use the tools that he had. But, and you're seeing this in Michoacan today, where you use the military, yeah, you might bring some semblance of security back to the streets in the short term, But unless you have a society that is based on rule of law, unless you have judicial systems to back it up, penal systems, jails, and all the verticals, if you will, associated with justice, you're going to have some challenges. And so I think what Calderon had was the challenge of dealing with security at the same time as the country was trying to build these institutions that they needed to really have a safer and more secure country. And so that remains a challenge today. There are pockets that I will tell you are very insecure. And at the same time, I will tell you, and I will encourage you, you can travel in and out of Mexico very comfortably. The tourist areas, I think you should feel very safe. I spend 4.5 days a week in Mexico City, and I feel very comfortable there. And I would encourage people to travel to Mexico. Just as I would say, in the same breath, there are parts of Washington, D.C., and New York, and L.A. that I wouldn't wander off to at the wrong time of day or night. There's probably parts of McAllen you shouldn't be out at in the middle of the night. So, don't leave your common sense at the border when traveling in Mexico, and I think you can travel pretty safely.
Now, you earlier described the relationship between Calderon and Bush as a little more fruitful and productive. Can you elaborate on that, and what do you think the net effect of that productive relationship has on the region today?
Well, certainly the signature initiative was probably Merida in terms of security. And that really, in many respects, was both the outgrowth of the relationship that had been developed during the Fox administration on the intelligence side and Mexico's willingness to partner up with the United States on law enforcement. And Merida tends to I think the detractors tend to focus on some of the big, the helicopters or this sort of thing. The truth is it's much more than, quote, hardware. It is also what I call the rule of law and community-based focuses. There are things that we do very well in the United States. We train people well. Our law enforcement is amongst the best in the world. Our judicial systems are the envy of every other country in the world. And when we have this sort of resource, and through Merida have the opportunity to partner up with Mexico as they try to build these institutions and rule of law, I think that has the potential to have a very profound effect. And so I think you have to look beyond the hardware and recognize that through Merida, we are partnering up with Mexico to build a much more transparent rule of law culture. And that's ultimately a good thing. And I think we in the United States should be very proud of our capacity to do that and the leadership that we show in other countries when we do that.
Now, the nature of public policy is such that it frequently does not bear fruit until years later. And so I'm wondering what public policy initiatives you saw as U.S. ambassador that are now beginning to bear fruit, particularly on the Rio Grande Valley region.
On the Mexican side or the U.S. side or both sides? Look, I think we can start with NAFTA. And I don't want to spend a lot of time because there are figures familiar to everyone. I'm not going to recite the litany of numbers that are related to that. But I think the combination of trade and other things going on in the world have brought this right back around to what is characterized as Mexico's moment. And I have always felt, from the perspective of the border, when Mexico is having a moment, we're probably going to be the beneficiaries of that in some way. I think this one is going to be much more than a moment. And so let me try to frame this from the perspective of the valley. And if you look out and you see what the potential for, let's say, energy reform is for northeastern Mexico. I don't think anybody has traveled the Eagle Ford Shale without being amazed at the growth and the investment and what has gone on in that region. In terms of moving not only our country towards energy independence, but creating opportunity in that stretch. And if you've flown over this stretch of border, I don't think anybody is struck by the fact that where you have thousands of wells north of the river, you have 3 or 4, productive assets south of it. With energy reform, I think you have the possibility of transforming a region essentially from Eagle Ford out to Burgos, which is on the Mexican side, into perhaps the most competitive manufacturing energy logistic platform in the world. At a time when, if you look around the world, there are very few good economic stories. China's flat, Europe's flat. Actually, China's not flat. They're growing at a pace less than they really need to. And the United States is going to be the engine, really, as it always has been, ultimately, for global growth. And when you leverage that with what Mexico's doing and you look at our border, you really see an extraordinary opportunity. I don't know how many, BBVA Compass fellow is here. Where is he? Nathaniel Karp's report of the 1222, I think, talked about the potential of a $1.8 trillion impact on the border region. That's significant. And that, I think, begs not only recognize the opportunity, it begs the need for us to get out in front of this. You know, Carlos and I were talking earlier, right now it seems to be very popular to talk about the inequality and the gap in incomes and these sorts of things, and it's as though, you know, there's this revelation. And my comment to Carlos was, that in of itself is a reflection of education gaps. And I think as a region where you're going to have this economic opportunity, what we have to focus on as leaders is education. I mean, real job growth and real opportunity growth is going to be a byproduct of education, K through 12, the things the University of Texas is doing down here, the med school. I think these are extraordinary opportunities, and they're going to be wonderful assets, but there's more to that. There's also the roads, there's also the health system, there's also the logistics platforms that as community leaders we have to get out in front. The economics of energy, I think, will be very solid, and the private sector is going to come in here, and energy companies are going to be on both sides of that border, interconnecting in ways. And I know we're just a little bit outside that play, but we're going to be the beneficiaries of that. And it's really it's a time to take a deep breath, look out into there, and realize that we have some challenges and real opportunities as a region. In some respects, I don't know that it's too unlike what happened in the wake of the investment in maquilas in the 70s. You got this sense that a lot was going to build up around the maquilas. And then we spent the next 20 years playing catch up on infrastructure because we couldn't alternately either get Washington or Mexico City's attention, you know, on some of these things. This time I think it'll be very different because energy tends to get everybody's attention. And what we have to do is get Washington and the DF thinking more strategically, and that's going to be driven by people probably in this room. And I really think, but I look out and I see nothing but very positive indicators. But the sort of the bumps along the road, I think, are going to be things like infrastructure and what we do in terms of, most basically, education.
Now, these indicators obviously will be affected by the new administration of Peña Nieto. What are the implications of his election in particular, but in general, the recapture of power by the PRI?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's sort of interesting because in the wake, you know, you had 70 years of the PRI, something that a Latin American author had once characterized as the perfect dictatorship. And they asked him why. He says, well, because it looks like a democracy. They have elections, but let's face it, we know who's going to win. And then you had the PAN in power for 12 years. And so I guess the question that I was most asked when President Peña Nieto was reelected and the PRI was kind of swept back in because he was reelected by nice margins was, is this the return of the old PRI? And my comment was, well, even if it was, and I don't necessarily think it is. Even if it was, this isn't the old Mexico. And there is no single group more important to a democracy than the middle class. It's a middle class that will hold government accountable and set the expectations. And what you have seen, and I recognize that it's a relative middle class. People say, when I use that word, they say, well, you know, how can you be middle class if you're making X per capita? No, it's a relative middle class that has expanded in Mexico, and those are the people that'll hold government more accountable. It is the expansion of the media, the role of the media in Mexico. And I recognize that you still have two very large dominant providers in the electronic space, but you have a lot of pencils and radios. You have a lot of newspaper and you have a lot of radio. It is Mexico's integration into any number of multilateral organizations that externally provide some benchmarks and are keeping an eye on the country. It is Mexico's level of integration with the U.S. And so you have between the middle class, the media, the multilateral organizations, you have a number of groups and interest in place to hold the PRI more accountable. Now, what they have done that I think is almost part of their DNA, their capacity to govern, something that had been developed over 70 years, is they have been very good operators, if you will, both legislatively and in terms of the messages they project externally. I don't think it's any surprise that in the transition, there was in President Peña Nieto's organization the capacity to reach out across the aisle and form a pact, not a bipartisan, tripartisan, with the center-right party and the center-left party. He was generous of spirit even in the transition, and with Calderon encouraged or coordinated the filing of some of the early reform initiatives, labor and I think labor and maybe, I don't know if education was filed in the transition, but perhaps shortly thereafter. And so they created some momentum built around tripartisan cooperation. I think that's indicative of the PRI DNA. Whereas historically in those 70 years, they had to accommodate interest within the PRI, the labor interest, the business interest, and they just sort of, they had everything done within the PRI. That DNA allowed them to recognize what it would take to operate in the public space, in the legislative space, and coordinate with the PAN and the PRD. And so, no, it's not the old PRI, but it's got enough of the DNA to suggest that they have a capacity to govern. But most importantly, they're governing, I think, driven by the recognition that Mexico is a country that is demanding from its leadership that they be more accountable, and as a country wants to be more competitive. Listen, you'd have never gotten energy reform under the old sort of mindset of, the nationalistic, and I'm careful about the nationalistic sort of sense that energy was the preserve of the state, of the sovereign. What I think the Mexican mindset is, no, that energy, that resource is there to be developed for the benefit of the people of Mexico. They want to be more competitive. So the mindset has shifted in a way that allows this government to get out and lead on some of these issues that historically would have never been addressed.
Let's talk about Pemex a little more. The idea that virtually coming out of the gate, he was able to achieve energy reform with Pemex. Tell us the significance of that.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say virtually coming out of the gates. It was at the end of the first year. And as you know, in Mexico, you have 6-year terms with no re-election. You have midterm elections at 3 years. And any of us that have been around the political process recognize that the first year, it is the time to do the large things. And so I think what you had was a very good kind of the rhythm of reform in Mexico. You started with the labor, the fiscal, or the education, the fiscal, and then you went, telecom was in there, and then you went, it was like double down. Towards the end of the year, get this energy thing done. And really, it was at the point of both maximum political capital for this administration, and at the same moment when the window was both widest open and about to start closing. Because as you go into year 2, there's still a lot of work to be done on that energy legislation. As you go into year 2, it's what they call the secondary legislation, which is essentially a rulemaking process, or what we would characterize as rulemaking. And then you go into probably some surmountable judicial challenges, perhaps. And then towards the end of the year, you might actually have some contracts being led under the new regime. So I think it was really an administration that managed the rhythm and the momentum and used the moment of maximum leverage to get this energy reform. What does it mean? I mean, it's just an enormous shift in mindset about how a resource will be utilized. It's hard to get your arms completely around or appreciate what it means unless you look at textbooks that kids were studying for the last 70 years where it talked about this patrimony and the resource, and it was in the hands of the Mexicans and never should be opened up to people that would steal it and pillage it and loot it. And from that sort of to the mindset of, no, this is ours, we have to leverage it and use it for the beneficiary of Mexicans. I don't think people appreciate completely what it took to shift that mindset, or the leadership that it took from this administration and the other parties working in concert. It would have been very easy for any of the other parties just to peel off and just play the gotcha game for political game in the short term. And in fact, I was visiting with the Speaker of the House, had breakfast with him earlier this week, and we talked about that. And he said, Tony, you know what? The risk of leadership is losing. That if you really get out on point and show leadership, you're going to take a few arrows. And you're going to take them during that period of transition and in the interim as we move towards both a midterm calendar and a country that is going to, I think, at some point this year say, we want it now. Didn't we vote for it last year? There is some time of transition and time for real profound change to start to bear fruit. And sadly, there are very few political leaders that will make the difficult decisions knowing that it may cost them in the intermediate, and the fruits will not be born until 10 or 15 years after they're long been run out of office. This administration, I think, has recognized that and has done a lot of the right things.
Now, this comes at a time when the U.S. is having its own oil boom with fracking. What do you think the implications of all that new energy, essentially, would have on a region like the Rio Grande Valley?
Well, look, I think you kind of look at it short, intermediate, and long. I think short, you're going to see a lot of investment, a lot of activity, whether it be from producers trying to position themselves with partnerships with Pemex. I think that's short term, you're going to see that investment. Intermediate, I think it moves us towards the capacity to be very competitive, particularly in manufacturing, because of the relationship between gas and electricity and your cost of production. Longer term, I think it's very interesting because Mexico will have the ability, much as we've seen in the last 5 years in the United States, to move from significant producer of oil to strategic producer. Don't underestimate the value of a resource like energy in terms of your geopolitical weight. When you're a significant producer, it gives you a much more significant place at the table in terms of these discussions that will go on. So I think from the short, intermediate, and long, it all looks very positive. From the standpoint of the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and I keep focusing on the U.S. and Mexico, but think about what it means as a region. Many of the arguments that were made about NAFTA and the integration of our markets and the weight that it would give us in the economy are now will be that much stronger. When you think about the three countries, 500, 550, almost 600 million people, democratically elected, energy independence, if we integrate these markets, things like the XL pipeline, quite frankly, is long overdue. I think this administration just got to get off a dime, make a decision, do the right thing. And would lead to the kind of NAFTA plus. We constantly are asking ourselves, and after NAFTA, what? Well, if you think about the two issues that were not discussed at NAFTA because they were considered far too political and would kill the entire agreement, they were immigration and energy. And Mexico has now stepped up in a very significant way on energy, and I think will allow us to see more integration and more independence between the three NAFTA countries. And it is absolutely about time that the United States step up and do what we need to do on immigration so that you can see the further integration, if you will, of our labor markets so that people can flow more efficiently to highest and best use as human beings. So what I see after NAFTA could be accomplished very straightforwardly and Mexico has done the energy reform. That was part of what was not discussed 20 years ago. And we need to do immigration. And then we need to, the second part of that is going to be integrate ourselves into larger trade agreements like the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific. And once you do that, you'll have united about 80% of the world's economies in a way that will allow for a freer flow of trade. Bringing it all back to where we are right at that point where it links up, where it meets, here on the border, here between the Eagle Ford and the Burgos. here where we have the potential to be the most competitive manufacturing platform in the world. So you start here, you build out, and you know when it's all said and done, you got to come home. And that's right here along the border.
Let's talk about immigration a bit. Just yesterday, House Republicans in Congress released a set of principles regarding immigration, and for the first time is actually talking about pathway to citizenship. How significant is that from the perspective of Mexico?
Pathway to citizenship? Curiously, not and I haven't surveyed on this recently, but so I'm basing it on about 5 to 10-year-old surveys. And I think it's important to distinguish. When you ask me from the perspective of the Mexican government, is pathway to citizenship a critical issue? And I will tell you, during my time at the embassy, the answer would be no. And largely it was stated this way. How can we in good faith as a government argue that our people should be citizens of another country? And I think you can understand that. I mean, that's reasonable enough. And then the second, and this came from people I think in leadership that were honest about the historic lack of opportunity in Mexico, was how can we argue that they should be allowed to succeed in your country when we're not doing enough for them here, that we have certain responsibilities that have not met? And I always thought that was very honest, that people would talk about that issue from that perspective that way. And so I think if you ask me from Mexico's perspective, I think from the perspective of people that have lived in this country most of their lives, whether it would be people that would come under the dreamer type stuff, kids that have grown up here, I think it's very important because their relationship in every respect is with the United States, not with Mexico. So I think from that group, it's a very different perspective. From an older generation, it may be more important that, as opposed to pathway to citizenship, that it simply be a status. If I've been here 25 years in this country, 30 years in this country, I'm 55 years old and working, maybe citizenship isn't critical. I still have some sense of my frame of reference is still Mexican, so I don't, a guest worker program. So look, where you stand on this many times depends on where you sit, right? I happen to think that we do need a pathway to citizenship. I can't tell you how many times, and Ricardo, you've done your naturalization ceremonies, people go through the process, it's the proudest day of their lives, and you always like to point out to them that you envy them because they remember the day they were made citizens, as opposed to the rest, some of us that, I came into this world screaming. And so I think you need that so that you can create that opportunity for people to have that extraordinary sense of pride in what they've now become a part of. So I think you need that pathway to citizenship. I think you need expansive guest worker program for people that really, for them, that's all they really wanted. I think for the dreamers, you got to recognize that they are in every sense, but status, already American. And that's not just the Republican Party, but a lot of people within the Democrat Party they got to cowboy up and do the right thing and get beyond the next election. And I think what they'll realize is it's not those that are screaming the loudest that are ultimately going to make the difference in their next election. It's a whole lot of folks that are waiting for the right thing to be done that'll support them.
Now, you paint a very optimistic picture about the economic prospects of the region, but always looming in the background are the Mexican drug cartels. Mm-hmm. Just recently, Peña Nieto allowed for the legalization of self-defense forces in Mexico. What's the significance of that?
Well, I think in retrospect it was a misstep, and I think he's acknowledged that very quickly. And it may have been a message misread. I'm not so sure that what he was not giving voice to was a frustration of people that want to defend themselves. And yet very quickly realized that the history of militias, essentially, not only in Latin America, but anywhere, has not been a good one. In fact, General Petraeus was in Mexico not 2 weeks ago, and he made the comment, this is not a genie that you want out of the bottle. And so what you've seen now, and this specifically is Michoacan, is you've seen the president essentially set the local and state police aside, come in with a federal presence, and a very significant show of force in the wake of which they're going to try to construct something that resembles a rule of law. It's a challenge. But you can't empower, embolden these sorts of citizens groups without also creating the risk that they will essentially become fronts for other cartels. I mean, that was really the big concern. That sure, you had I hate to use language that sounds like telecommunications language, but you had an incumbent provider in Michoacan, in a dominant cartel, and you had these militia, citizens, I think initially, and well-intended, saying, yeah, we're going to defend ourselves. And very quickly, you had the sense that this citizens militia was now a front for another criminal organization, and you can't do that. And so I think wisely the president moved away from that position, injected the military, and said, okay, what we're going to try to do with this citizens militia is they by the same rules will integrate them into the law enforcement community and into the security of the country, but they're going to have to come in under the same rules. And we're going to have to vet and do background, these sort of things. Look, it's a hot spot, and it is, yet at the same time, if you look at Michoacan, you have the port of Lázaro Cárdenas, which is one of the biggest ports and tremendous economic activity. And this Sunday, most of us will sit down to some guacamole. It'll have come out of Michoacan. It's the greatest avocados in the world. There's a lot of business in and out and a lot of movement, but certainly the security thing has flared up. You saw a similar situation a handful of years ago, maybe 3 or 4, in Ciudad Juárez. Now it looks to be relatively calm. You've seen this in Tijuana, occasionally in Reynosa. And so you have flare-ups. Sadly, when things are relatively calm, it doesn't always mean the state has established everything they need to maintain it. It simply means that a corridor is not being competed for. That's the nature of it. Look, I think we're seeing some movement in this country to recognize that, heck, I mean, even Governor Perry is talking about decriminalization of marijuana. Let me say this, I don't think that's necessarily the answer to the drug problem or to the security problem in Mexico. I think it'd be naive to think that if you legalize marijuana, that would go away. Their problem is more profound. Their challenge is really one of rule of law and building real security apparatus. But at least we're having a broader dialogue about the demand side.
In a couple of weeks, President Obama is scheduled to travel to Mexico for the North American Leaders Summit. What do you expect to come from that?
Un abrazo.
Nothing beyond
No,
that?
no, listen, I don't want to be, look, I think you got some sense of my, of how I feel about it. I think the moments are important. I don't want to underestimate that. The symbolism of our presidents, our leaders. It's called the Leaders Summit, Canadian, U.S., and Mexico. I think that's important. And I think the focus on the economic dialogue is important. And maybe there's some issues that will get unstuck. But, and I said this the other morning at a meeting of the American Business Interest in Mexico. I said, I don't want to sound too flip, and maybe this is more reflective of my conservative or libertarian leanings, but I'm more concerned about what business is doing and the ease at which they're investing and a regulatory environment that creates some certainty and openings that are going to allow for the private sector to partner with Pemex. I'm more concerned about all these things that allow capital to move and be deployed in a way that creates opportunity than I am with the snapshot or the photo. I think that's good, and I want to see it because I want to see our leaders cooperate and get along the way they do. But I'm not so naive to think that if we get a good picture, that from one day to the next, the environment is going to change in terms of investment. That's something that we have to be doing each and every day. So to the extent that they're really listening to business, listening to investors, that they are, quote, treating capital well, that ultimately is, I think, more important in terms of the growth and the opportunity for our two countries than the snapshot. But again, I know that sounded a bit flip, But I'd have said the same thing had it been a Republican president and a different president of Mexico. It's just important to create an environment for investment. Ultimately, that I think is the most important thing.
Ambassador, my final question to you, from your perspective, what are the economic prospects of the Rio Grande Valley as they relate to Mexico?
I think they're good. Listen, I think I've talked about that a bit this morning. And you asked me my general impressions as you know, from yesterday to today. One, I do get back a lot more often than I think you appreciate. Generally to Brownsville, and generally with my niece there. But I guess rather than try to be somewhat prescriptive in the sense of saying this is what you got to do and this is what I think ought to be doing, I happen to think that the most extraordinary asset we have are the people of the Rio Grande Valley. They really are. I mean, resilient. I mean, you've seen the kind of challenge that we faced over whether it was the transition in the different industries, the freezes taking us from largely agricultural to, we need to absolutely just keep believing in ourselves across the entire valley and have a sense of maybe be a bit more cohesive at times. And that's okay that we compete, but sometimes cohesion's good too. And I don't see, I see nothing but very positive prospects for our two countries, and I see this region as really central to the prospects of both countries. So it would be keep believing in ourselves, focus like a laser on that educational part of it, because long term it's really going to be that K through 12. You know, you asked me earlier this morning at breakfast, you said, do you think the university ought to have a whole international relations, international business thing? I don't know. I think that we ought to have very, very strong science, you know, the whole STEM stuff, science, technology, and this mathematics, this sort of thing, because those are the kind of things that, regardless of what's going on larger, they'll prepare you for change as well. If you have that basic skill set, that basic toolbox, regardless of where the economy's headed, you'll be in a position to compete. So, look, I keep believing in ourselves and keep investing in education.
It's now 9:30, and I want to thank you all for showing up and talking with us this morning. And especially I want to thank Ambassador Tony Garza for revisiting.